it's pretty clear to me that there is actually broad bipartisan consensus that our country is on a fiscally unsustainable path right now. The 2010 report by the Bipartisan Policy Center's Debt Reduction Task Force, Mr. Hoagland, I believe you were a member of that task force, included a very sobering warning that the federal budget is on a dangerous, unsustainable path. Federal spending is projected to rise substantially faster than revenues, and the government will be forced to borrow ever-increasing amounts. Federal debt will rise to unmanageable levels, which will push interest rates up, endanger our prosperity, and make us increasingly vulnerable to the dictates of our creditors, including nations whose interests may differ from ours. And we've talked a little bit about that earlier from some of the other questions. My constituents are quite honestly very perplexed that Washington continues to borrow 40-some cents of every dollar it spends. They can't get their arms around that. And there's a recognition now that without significant changes to our fiscal policy, the national debt itself is going to become an existential threat. And I'd like each of the panelists, if you could just comment, what are the implications of current debt levels? What are the consequences of increased levels? And then what really is the turning point where our debt becomes unmanageable, where it becomes an unmanageable situation? Mr. Casey?
Well, I think on the most of that question, I will defer to the economists, but I will say that one thing I think we need to keep in mind is that we fling around the term debt ceiling. What we're talking about here is Congress's power to borrow money and how we should be paying our bills based on that or based on some other method of raising revenue. So I think it's very important to keep that clearly in mind.
Mr. Hoagland, you were a member of that task force as well.
Yes, and in fairness, Congressman, that task force also recommended a balanced budget, a balanced plan that included tax increases as well as spending cuts, and going forward more on the spending side than on the reduction in the rate of growth. The implications of the debt level that we're headed at 77% growing into the future, I think has a major, will jeopardize, quite frankly, our standing in the world. When we have about 40–50% of this debt owned by investors outside of the United States, we're raising questions about the sovereignty of this country going forward. And in terms of where's the turning point, I think that's the problem. Most economists would say they can't answer that question. Who knows when that last drop into the test tube turns the water blue? But it will turn at some point, and that's the problem. When it turns, it will turn fast. That's why I think you have to have a plan going forward to avoid that date coming. I don't know. There's a book out on this called This Time's Different. This time is not different. Something will happen. We just want you to control that so that it has some process behind it.
Now, knowing that the United States is still a safe haven in terms of money flocking here based on what's happening in Europe, I mean, can we learn anything of what's happening in Europe, basically, on how capital's fleeing here?
We are not Greece. We're not Italy. We're not Spain. But I think when you look at the level of spending there relative to their assets, I think you end up with a situation where you do create social disorder, and which is very dangerous.
So the three basic things. First is that with all that debt, you're going to see in the future a lot more of government's resources, federal government's resources, being used just to pay off the interest on the debt from the past. As I said in my testimony, Americans expect services from the taxes they pay. They don't expect just that you service the debt from previous services. The second is interest rates are going to rise. We've now increased the debt sufficiently that all previous debates about whether deficits matter for interest rates can be set aside. It has now risen enough that it will matter, and it will matter a lot. Interest rates will rise, and it will rise a lot faster and further than they ever would have otherwise. And the third, as my colleague here was just saying, it's like a family or any business. If you take on far too much debt, you lose control of your own future. You lose control of your path forward. Somebody else is going to be able to dictate the terms to you as to what you're going to do. And that dictator in this case will be the bondholders, the credit markets. We lose control of our future as a nation, as these countries in Europe, as Mr. Hoagland notes, we are not Spain or Italy or Greece, but we will have one thing in common. If we keep this path, we will lose control of our future as they have lost control of theirs.
Can you comment in terms of if there's even a 1% or a 2% increase in interest rates, what the effect is going to be on interest payments on a dollar amount or?
Well, if you think about a 1% payment and you've got $15 trillion out there, that's $150 billion.
All right, thank you. Time's expired. Mr. Kind is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you.